Welcome to BTG Talks. Today we have the pleasure to talk to one of the most influential thinkers worldwide. Daron Acemoglu is a brilliant economy professor in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and expert in political economy. Together with James Robinson, he has written The Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy in 2006, Why Nation Fails in 2012, and The Narrow Corridor last year. His research is an extraordinary attempt to grasp the fundamental of political, economic, and social institutions through the study of their evolution. History reveals as a key access to this phenomenon. In The Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, the authors develop a framework for analyzing the creation and consolidation of democracy and dictatorship. Why Nations Fail tries to understand why some countries achieve a high level of prosperity while others remain poor. His last book is about liberty and offers a framework to explain how liberty flourishes in some states but falls in others. The framework he offers provides an original and more comprehensive approach of social interaction. Today, we want to talk with him about what's going on in Chile and also to approach other global issues. Good afternoon, Daron. Nice to be here. It's a pleasure to
Thank you, Sylvia. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
That's great. I want to start the interview with this question. In the last year, we have seen social uprising in different countries. For example, in Hong Kong, Colombia, Lebanon, Iran, Chile also. Do you see a common pattern in this?
I think there are a number of trends that are affecting many countries, and the way that the political system responds to these trends and to these grievances has fallen short in many of them, and that has led to growing discontent. The problems, I think, in places like Iran and Hong Kong are somewhat different. They really are related to lack of freedom, lack of political voice, dictatorship in Iran, and fear of those things coming to Hong Kong, or already there, but intensifying. But the rest, when you think of many countries that are already democratic, we have a problem of great aspirations that have been built with democracy that have largely been frustrated. That's been partly because growth over the last 3 decades in much of the world has been rather unequal, sometimes slower than anticipated as well, but most importantly, very unequal. It has also because the institutions themselves haven't often functioned well, both in terms of responding to growing inequality, providing high quality public services, but also in terms of dealing with some key problems such as corruption, incompetence in bureaucracies, justice issues. And I think all of those have built up a lot of anger and frustration. And in many of the cases you've mentioned, these institutions have also failed to provide good responses, and that has triggered either a turn to authoritarian anti-establishment politicians or sometimes just downright people pouring into the streets. And this is not unusual. If you look at history, many periods have experienced similar malaise that has then led to protests and people getting involved in politics in different ways than they did. The key is, how do you respond to that? Can you turn that into something positive, or is that going to unravel into sort of democratic collapse? I think that's the question that we have to grapple with, and that's the question to which we have to bring answers to.
Yes. You stress the quality of the institutions as a key factor for prosperity, but how does the context in which institutions emerge matter? Is the inclusiveness of the process through which institutions are built a requirement for its quality? And Does an inclusive participatory process ensure quality of institutions? Right now, our constitution is being under consideration, and it's not because of its quality, but the main issue is because of its legitimacy.
I think those are excellent questions. In some sense, we want to distinguish these two dimensions of institutions to some degree. One is how inclusive they are, meaning how much voice do they give to different groups, different interests. As far as the procedures work, are they bringing people to the table or providing just power to just one group or one individual or one branch of the government, versus the quality, which is how effective they are. These two dimensions are not unrelated, but they are also rather distinct. I think the current crisis has elements of both of them, meaning that the institutions that we have, they evolve historically. Often they are imperfect solutions to the problems we faced in the past, and they're not necessarily solutions to the problems we are facing now and we will be facing in the future. I think that's true for Chile, that's true for the US. Part of the reason why US inequality has increased, education hasn't kept up, quality of education hasn't kept up, is we live in a very globalized world. The nature of economic interactions, technology has changed, the nature of worker representation has changed, and institutions haven't necessarily kept up with them. That has reduced their quality. But there's also an important element that institutions haven't been as inclusive as I think they were promised. I think the ideal of democracy that people somehow had in their minds, and it's not completely true, it's not completely untrue, is that democracy, everybody is going to have a voice. But of course, nothing exactly works that way. People should have a voice in a democratic system, but at some point, the executive or the bureaucracy will have to make decisions, but they have to make those decisions taking into account those voices, those views that they have heard. And I think what has gone wrong in some sense is both the reality and the appearance of this, meaning that in the reality, increasingly many voices were marginalized, but also the way that many decisions were made really did not appear to pay attention to the broader context. I think, for instance, if you take the US example, the way that the US government dealt with the financial crisis has some elements of that. There were many voices at the time. They were asking for harsher treatments of bankers or trying to help homeowners, keep people, make people accountable for the semi-criminal things that they made. But then there were also some urgent things to do, like fixing the financial system. So some of the voices were not listened to. But at the end of the day, the appearance of it was also terrible, that it looked like bankers' old friends come back and rescue them while homeowners lose their home and people are losing their jobs. So it's this combination of these two things. When we are not sufficiently inclusive, fewer voices are heard, it's easier to ignore them, and then we give the impression of even ignoring them more. And I think those elements are true in Brazil, those elements are true in the Philippines, and those elements are true in Chile also.
And when you want to do the institutions more inclusive, you need to transfer power from the elites to the citizens. And in your book, Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, one of your building blocks is conflict, social conflict. Conflict is the source of political changes. And this conflict grounds in the opposition preference of different groups. And the social unrest in Chile is an expression of such conflict. Democratization process is a possible result for social conflict, but you also mention others alternative like repression or revolution. What elements of your model of democratization do you think are present now in Chile? And what are the risks you see in this kind of process? What are the typical pitfalls we have to avoid?
Right, I think those are also excellent questions. So the Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy was written almost 20 years ago. So there are some parts of the book that were backward-looking and some parts of it that I think still apply. You've singled out the parts that I believe still apply, which is conflict, when people who feel they don't have enough voice, they express their dissatisfaction, and in response, the political system has to make concessions. Or it finds a way of not making concessions, but that would be more repressive or more risky. So I think those realities are definitely present. What's not, I think, completely captured by the framework in that book is that that was a very unidimensional model of conflict between the elite and the citizens, the rich and poor, that obviously is still present in Chile, it's still present in many other parts, but it's many more divisions are relevant, and there are many other factors that are important as well. And part of the reason why I'm emphasizing that is because, in some sense, the threat to democracy in many countries, and there's no doubt that Chile has been a very successful democracy in many senses. It's after the Pinochet's regime got transferred power to a democratic government, it has had, uncontested, there's been no contestation of democratic governance. Elections have gone without fraud. So there are many dimensions in which Chile has been a successful democracy. But I think the threat in many places, including the US, including Brazil, is that an autocrat, an authoritarian leader willing to weaken institutions, sometimes undermine institutions, can come to power. So those are the aspects that we have to take into account. So enriching it that way, I think, the threats are either things go on for too long as they are without really responding to the needs and the concerns of people. I think that's what happened to some degree in Chile. That's what happened in the US. For many years, inequality was increasing. Many people felt they weren't listened to, and that lasted for a very long time. That can erupt into protests, and that those protests can lead to violence. I think that's a very important thing. In some sense, the happy medium that we try to highlight in the economic origins, and also it sort of plays a role in some sense in the narrow corridor as well, is that prodding from the bottom comes up, but it doesn't lead to all-out violent conflict, but it leads to the right types of concessions and institutional changes. So, but the bad outcome is that it actually erupts in violence, and that's happened. The story of the Arab Spring is exactly great expectations, but violent repression of all of these demands. Or it can lead to a response within the democratic system, but a bad response. Like, for example, a populist who destroys some of the institutions, some of the checks, some of the judiciary oversight. And I think we are seeing that in Brazil. We are seeing that in the US. We've seen that in the Philippines. There's a danger that we may be seeing that in Mexico. So I think that sort of tearing down the institutions rather than reforming them is another danger that can happen. And then, of course, another sort of bad outcome would be false reforms, that you pretend to do reforms, but nothing gets done, and then the discontent builds up. So there are many pitfalls. I think the question is, how do we find a middle ground where, you listen to the voices, but you find an institutional solution to it that reforms the strengths that you have without abandoning it. And I think that's where, in some level, in the grand scheme of things, that's where US is at the moment, in the next election, for example, and I think that's where Chile is.
And in Chile, we have seen a lot of violence. The social unrest of citizens and the acts of violence of radical groups are not necessarily the same. It's not obvious that the transfer of political power from the elites to the citizens as a result of the democratization process will ensure social stability in Chile. And it's even likely, and a lot of people think, that this violence group will continue active despite political reforms. So violence appears as a double-edged sword. In one hand, it encourages reforms, but on the other hand, threatens these reforms. So what happens when the whole democratization process is threatened by the same violence that helped to give birth to it? Which successful experience of democratizations in the last decades can we look to learn from?
Yeah, I think what you put is exactly right. The threat of people really being fed up with the system and taking extra legal actions, pouring into the streets, blocking streets, all of those threats are an impetus to reform. if the political system is not generating enough voice for people, what other option they have. But when that translates into violence, that is both bad, because violence is bad, it costs lives and it costs damage to everything, but it also poisons the rest of the reform process. And we've seen that in many places. So if you look at the history of democracy in Western Europe, and even in the early 20th century in Latin America, in most of the time, democratization didn't come because current power holders said, let's change things. It often came with some sort of demands. In the UK context, that was first from the middle classes, but also from some of the workers that were dislocated by technology. Then it came from the Chartist movement, from the trade unions. And even in the UK, where this was happening the most smooth way, sometimes it led to violence. People broke machines, burned houses. Even the suffragettes, women's enfranchisement, they burned houses, they blocked roads. So even that wasn't a very peaceful process. But the other side of the violence was present from time to time, that protesters were massacred in a few instances. But on the whole, it went as smooth as anywhere else. In many other places, in Latin America in particular, there was much more violent responses. So the question is, how can we sort of try to limit the violence? I think bring it down to zero, for the reasons that you articulated, is going to be very difficult. And we've seen that in other protests too. One of the bad paths is that a fringe group among the protesters, often from the very extreme, who wants to further incite the situation, resorts to violence, and then the police or the authorities use that as an excuse and they clamp down on everybody else. And I think that's a very, very dangerous path, and it poisons the whole process. And then each side starts recriminating the other. So restraint is the only sort of possibility. And I think, in my opinion, the onus of restraint is more on the shoulders of the authorities. I think the extent to which they have access to arms and organization is much greater than protesters. And of course, if they respond to violence, that's just more deadly, more jarring, more disrupting of the whole process. So it's very important for the police, for the authorities, to show restraint in such situations. But also, I think it's part of the protesters' thing that to try to isolate the more violent elements so that their voices are heard better. Because I think one thing we know is that the threat, and again, Chilean history as well as history in many other countries in Latin America and Europe, when things become polarized, nothing effective gets done. So avoiding sort of the violent path is actually in the interests of long-run reform and long-run effective outcomes.
And right now, the government is worried about the looming economic crisis. And I wanted to ask you, the high levels of uncertainty are not good for the economy, but they are intrinsic to a democratization process, probably. Are there democratization processes that have involved deep reforms, like they want here in Chile, without economic cost in the short term? Or there are always?
I think there is always uncertainty, but if you look at the general process of democratization, so this is something I studied in some of my research, and the view, exactly because sometimes it's untidy, sometimes democracies don't do very well, there is this view that democracies are not good for economic growth, and then the firm hand of an authoritarian ruler is better. Chile is sometimes cited as an example. Look at under Allende, everything was chaotic, and then Pinochet came, and then he undertook reforms. Actually, the general trends in history are the complete opposite. That when dictatorships are not doing very well, especially economically, when they suffer through economic crisis, they collapse. That collapse is not very peaceful sometimes, or it creates uncertainty, it creates some chaos. But generally, that doesn't lead to a deepening of the economic crisis, and it subsides in about 3 or 4 years. And then democracies, those countries that democratize relative to those that didn't democratize, start growing, and they grow quite a bit in the next 20 years or so. Again, Chile is a good example of that. So I think as long as that transition can be, again, handled in a way that doesn't give in to violence, that uncertainty is something doesn't seem to be too big of a problem. But again, there's a big if there, because there are cases, just like in Egypt, just like in Syria, where violence erupts, and then you don't have a democracy, you don't have any of the things, and you have something even worse than the authoritarian regime before. So those are the cases to be avoided, and that's why I'm saying it's really in the interest of the civil society, of the protesters, of those who are not happy with the current situation, to really avoid and isolate the more violent elements, because it would at the end be to the detriment of the whole reform process.
And regarding dictatorships and their benefits, after the complete failure of centralized economy, China and Singapore arise as two economic successful examples of non-democratic states. Do you think the economic and political models of these countries are a threat to democracy in the sense that they present an economically successful alternative to liberal democracies?
Absolutely, yes, they are, absolutely. And there are a couple of reasons for that. I think one is because they are, and as an example, they create a rhetoric that countries in Africa, countries in Latin America, countries in Asia shouldn't be democratic and should emulate China or Singapore. For example, that's what you hear from Cambodia or Vietnam. They say, look, China is successful, we should be just like China. And if you make any demands for democracy in Cambodia or Vietnam, that's the argument that you're going to get. But also China actively helps autocrats in Africa, for example, and that is another. Now China is a global world power, and that sort of intervention in domestic affairs will also strengthen autocrats and sometimes weaken democratic movements. There's a big difference between Singapore and China. Singapore, I think, is not a perfect democracy by any stretch, but it is, it's a place where the rule of law applies. The state is quite responsive. The democratic process is weak, but demands generally are somehow heard. And it's very special. It's an island that relies on trade and stability. So there are a bunch of things that are different about Singapore. China, I think, is a very, very interesting case that we have to study and we have to understand. And obviously it has done amazingly well economically. But, let's not forget, China is still a lower middle income country. So the real proof of whether a very repressive, top-down authoritarian regime can work is whether, once it comes to the levels of income, like above 50% of the US, 75% of the US, can it continue to grow technologically, increase consumption, increase the range of skills that are being used in the economy. So all of those more complex things are still up for grabs in the Chinese case.
I want to change now to inequality and also to address education, the role of education and taxes. In Chile, inequality is very high. According to Piketty, capitalism leads to wealth concentration, and thus it is a threat to democracy. He also states that the world is returning towards patrimonial capitalism, in which much of the economy is dominated by inheritance wealth. In Chile, several policies have been discussed to address wealth concentration. For example, the top 1% tax is one, and regarding patrimonial capitalism, a group of members of the Congress presented just some weeks ago, a draft bill that limits inheritance in $5 million. Everything over $5 million go to the state. What is your stance about these two policies in addressing inequality?
So I actually first agree. High, very high, and persistent levels of inequality are a threat to democracy. I think the problem in Chile is not just economic inequality, but social inequality. So Chile is a very segregated society. There are people who come from more established families, go to the right schools, have the right social networks, and the rest that don't. So I think all of those contribute, and those are real threats to inequality. Has it become worse over time? I don't think so. I think in many parts of the world, social inequality has become less bad than it was before, although economic inequality has worsened in some parts of the world. But we'd also have to recognize the successes we've had in many of these things around the world. So a second ago, I mentioned my own research on democratization. So how does democratization achieve this growth? Well, again, the regularity is very interesting here. There seems to be one thing in common that almost all of the democracies do once they transition from dictatorship to democracy. They increase taxes and they invest more in education and health. So it's absolutely possible within the democratic system to increase taxes, to invest in education and health. Enough, perhaps not enough, we can do more. But there are very successful cases, again, the Scandinavian countries, but also whole of Europe, and to some degree even the US in the 50s and the 60s was following, healthy tax revenues invested in research, education, health, infrastructure. So those are definitely paths that are feasible. So I don't agree with the statement that capitalism will inevitably lead to higher inequality. And I think there are two aspects of that statement that I think are at a conceptual level misleadingly simple. One is, I think capitalism, a concept that I think was very useful in the 19th century. It really framed the Marxist and the Marxist-influenced historians' debates. But I'm not sure how much of a useful concept it is today. For the following reason, that it creates a false dichotomy. Egypt under Mubarak and Norway, they're both capitalists. They have private ownership of the means of production. But that's where the parallels stop. There's two economies are so different in terms of their technology, in terms of how they're organized, in terms of who has power on the workplace, regulations, political power, political processes. So putting those two into the same category creates a false dichotomy that really makes the discussion muddled. And then the second aspect that I disagree with that is sort of related, which is that, it's really about the politics of it that's so important. So when you say capitalism has this tendency, so it creates this false sense that, there is a easy causal link from the private means of private ownership of the means of production to this or to that. It's really most of the time mediated through political processes, and how the political process deals with it, who has political power, what are the institutions. Those are, again, critical things. Let me give another example from Scandinavia. So Sweden never abandoned private ownership. So according to this definition, the classic definition, will always be a capitalist economy. But from 1932 onwards, there were heavy labor market regulations, collective bargaining that pushed wages up and compressed wages, increased taxes on the middle class as well as on the rich. Actually, the rich are not taxed that much more heavily in Sweden than, say, the middle classes. And increased enough revenue invested in health, welfare state, education, and inequality was very stable until recently, due to globalization reasons, the top 1% increases, but less than in other places. So you see the way that the political process deals with those issues, I think, is critical. Bringing it into the Chilean context, I think, again, if we just anchor the discussion to capitalism, I don't think it's going to go to anywhere productive. Mm-hmm. If you blame the capitalism as the problem in Chile, then of course 50% of the country will say, no, there's nothing wrong, and we're going to resist that. Mm-hmm. But I think if the problem is how Chile has politically dealt with these problems, how it has taxed things, how it has regulated things, how it has created equal opportunity, I think then we're getting to somewhere that perhaps there can be a compromise. Chile has extremely low tax revenue. So taxes can be increased in Chile without destroying private enterprise. Those taxes can be used for better education, better healthcare, better opportunities. You can certainly try to undermine the basis of social inequality so that more opportunities in top businesses, in education, in universities, in politics is open to every Chilean. But again, that's a political choice. It's not something about capitalism. And of course, if wealth is very persistent across generation, we have a great tool to deal with that, which we used to use very heavily, estate taxation. But estate taxation is not the same as capping inheritances, because a lot of people are motivated by leaving some wealth to their children. So fairly high estate taxation, which is practiced in many countries, will still, if you're a billionaire, your children will still be very, very wealthy, but it's going and saying you cannot leave more than $2 million or something, that would be much more draconian.
Because many people have a lot of faith in education, and education plays a key role to address inequality. But if we compare inequality, for example, before taxes and transfers, what we observe is that most countries are highly unequal, including those with excellent educational system, like Finland, for example. Finland, before taxes and transfer, is almost unequal as Chile. So it looks like the market makes the countries unequal, but then with the policy and the institutions and with transfers and taxes,
I think
you
there's
can
some
reduce.
disagreement on that. It really depends on how you measure pre-tax inequality, like pensions matter a lot, self-employment matters a lot. There's some recent research that shows, or argues anyway, that, for example, the way that OECD does it, which probably some of your, is wrong, and it gives a misleading picture, and if you redo it correctly, you see that most of the difference between, say, Sweden and Finland and the US, I don't remember Chile, is pre-tax. So actually US has a very, very strange tax system. There are lots of problems with it, but it's quite redistributive. So if you look at, if you sort of deal with some of these problems, self-employment, unreported income, pensions, the difference between US and pre and post inequality is very similar to Sweden pre and post. The big difference is Sweden has a very compressed wage structure because the power of employers is better monitored and regulated. Their unions, their collective bargaining, and better education opportunities for Swedish people coming from low middle income backgrounds. So I think those are very important.
I have two more questions. One is about climate change, and the other one is about feminism. Climate change is a global problem. I think everyone agrees. There is consensus about the human influence in global warming, and the largest human influence has been the emission of greenhouse gases. China, US, European Union, and India are responsible for almost 60% of the global carbon emissions. And as the failed COP25 shows, sustainable growth remains unattainable. Given this, the degrowth movement has gained visibility. They argue that we cannot have growth without global warming. How should we address economic growth in the context of climate change? Is degrowth the only alternative to climate change, or?
I think my response is exactly like my response for capitalism. Again, I think there are a lot of false dichotomies being created, and a real existential problem is leading to extreme responses that really miss out the opportunities. So absolutely, I think everybody should be very concerned about climate change, and I completely agree with the degrowth movement by student strikes for climate change action. All of these groups are absolutely right about the dangers of climate change. But where they are wrong is in the solutions that they offer. And what we know from decades that, first of all, government regulation, when it's combined with the market, can work very well. But when you allow the government to make the allocation decisions just by itself, it leads to lots of problems. So completely replacing the market and the government saying this is how it's going to be and we're going to put a cap on growth, I think would be a terrible thing. Second, if you look at the successes we've had in climate change, and they are not few, there are quite a few, there's quite a lot actually, is that they've come when there is government-market partnership. I think the biggest success is, look at 40 years ago, there was no alternative to carbon-based energy. Today, renewable energies are cost-effective. Did the governments achieve this? Yes, not by themselves. Governments provided research subsidies and some places carbon taxes, but mostly research subsidies. People woke up, social norms changed, and researchers started working on renewable energies. Companies started investing in that. That's how we got here, and I think that's the path that we have to take. And if we take that path, growth is not a problem. Actually, the investments in renewables, creating a better network for energy, storable energy, all of these will be innovation hubs that contribute to growth. But moreover, you see the problem in Chile. There's still so much discontent here. You see the problem in the US. There's still so much discontent because the poor feel poor, are poor, and the developing world is in a much worse situation. To say that, no, we're going to put a brake on growth, I think would be disastrous in this scenario. But we don't need to. I think we can use the market with the right policy choices to make a lot of progress. And moreover, if you see China and the US, and to some degree India, saying no to even moderate carbon taxes, how are you going to get them to say yes to degrowth? I think it's insane. It's self-defeating.
But do we have time? Because it looks really possible that in the near future we can achieve sustainable growth. But till now we don't have that, and I don't know if we have enough time.
I think time is running out, but it's not discontinuous. Meaning that if we don't do it today, tomorrow is too late. But every day we're getting later and later, and that's why it's very important to come together around a feasible plan. And degrowth is not that feasible plan, but heavy taxation of carbon, augmented by carbon tariffs, so that countries, if they don't reduce their carbon, then they cannot export, and generous subsidies to better research, better technologies for renewable, geothermal, and other sources of energy. I think those are the directions for us to go.
On Sunday, we are celebrating Women's Day. Chilean female labor force participation rate is 48%, one of the lowest in Latin America. And the Metropolitan Labor Observatory estimated the gender pay gap in 29%, and it increases for higher levels of education. The traditional model of political economy focuses on class conflicts. When you talk about democratization process, the main focus is between the elite and the citizens or the middle class. How does your theory of democratization and the inclusive of institutions apply to the case of gender? And the other question and the last question is, do you think in gender issues, culture plays a role?
Of course, culture plays a role, norms play a role. I think otherwise it would be hard to explain why female labor force participation is so much lower in Muslim countries, not in every one of them, but in most of them. And it used to be lower in Catholic countries too. I think there is, and again, those norms, how families work and how people think of others' expectations, all of those are very important. And all of them together, they make gender a very, very important line of conflict in society. And in fact, it's a conflict on which sometimes we have done worse or much more late in terms of improvements. If you look at Switzerland and Britain, two leaders in democracy and many of the good things that come with democracy, neither of them had any rights for women well into the second half of the 19th century. In the Swiss case, much later. Women could not inherit money, could not open their own businesses. They needed to have permission from their parents or from their husbands. They were discriminated in law. They couldn't even make decisions for their children. They weren't believed. Norms kept them at home. How did that change? Well, it's the same sort of thing. Women started first arguing their case. Then they started protesting. Then they got political voice. That wasn't enough, so then they worked more to changing the norms. Is it perfect? No, not yet. But we're going. I mean, I think one important element was sexual harassment, and the recent changes with the Me Too have been a sort of a page turner. Is everything okay now? Absolutely not, but I think it's a process, and that process, just like other aspects of social inequality, is a work in progress. And Chile, sort of somewhat surprisingly in some sense, is behind in some of these things. But I think it is not unrelated to other aspects of social inequality being very high in Chile. And I do think that the current sort of discontent and demand for reforms will also open the way for greater equality between genders.
So are we going to see you on Sunday in the manifestation supporting women's rights?
I'm not here on Sunday.
Oh, that's a pity. Thank you, Daron.
Thank you.
Very
It's
much
great talking
for
to
this
you.
talk.